Thank you. Well, I know they have a script for me, and I've been known to deviate a bit, so I will.
Okay.
I won't even read the first question on the script. Give us an idea of how this whole entire experience for you has been.
Oh, that's a great question. It's been an experience of being in awe. It's been an experience of really validating what I think we all know, which is that we are a country of really interesting, committed leaders. One of the things I love about campaigns, the way I talk about it is that in a campaign you meet the angels walking among us. People that, if we lived 500 years, maybe we'd all find each other eventually. Those of us who think about the same kinds of issues or feel a certain way about our civic duty and our responsibility to each other. But in campaigns, everyone kind of finds each other around an issue or an election cycle. And so it's been a process of also meeting incredible community leaders who do their work without any expectation of award or attention, but do that work because that's what they have decided to take on, which is to serve their community. And so it's those kinds of experiences. It's also the experience of, at least for the first 5 seconds after I wake up, not knowing where I am. Usually it's about maybe less than 5 seconds, sometimes, depending on how much sleep.
That was my life this morning, actually.
Yeah, right?
We know, Stacey, we know.
They're never going to let me forget this.
No, we're not.
It's okay. Just let it ride with it. Just ride with it.
I'll let it go.
Yeah.
Senator.
Well, can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And I think we actually just had to use your language, one of those angels up here.
Yes.
Sarah, who founded and is leading the Iowa Harm Reduction Coalition, who I'm sure you just heard works with drug users.
Yep.
And so I'm wondering, can we kind of kick this conversation off a little bit with some of what we just heard? And can you talk to us? I mean, you've had so many roles, and I think we're going to dig into that a little bit. But as somebody who has had experience in dealing directly with people who have, sold drugs or are using drugs, Sarah's saying one of the things that would be most useful right now for the people she's working with is for the Department of Justice to support safe injection sites or spaces. Can you talk to us a little bit about where you might stand on that, and if that's something you would find a priority in your administration?
Well, what I would find as a priority is to, first of all, and it's unfortunate that this needs to be said, and I applaud your leadership, and I'm looking back at Stacey and the work you're doing and the voice you're providing, which is grounded by actually working on the ground and not some ideology. I would say this, that let's start by understanding that we did a great disservice to the American people when we had this so-called war on drugs, which was an abject failure. It criminalized what is a public health issue. And we are paying a price for that today. It is the way that our country treated this issue had the effect of contributing to one of the greatest shames that we face in our history, which is a system of mass incarceration, in particular of young black and brown men. We contributed to the idea that somehow people who are actually facing an addiction, who actually it is a disease, that they make a choice to be addicted, and so we are going to judge their choice and criminalize them for making bad decisions. Remember that era of just say no? And we're paying a price for that. And so we have to have a significant readjustment. And that readjustment has to include recognizing it as a public health matter, recognizing that substance abuse is a disease, and it needs to be treated as such. And that requires a number of things, including what I believe and what I'm advocating, which is that we have mental health on demand, mental health care on demand, that we have substance abuse treatment on demand. And so just like you can go into an emergency room and receive treatment, just walk in and they have to provide it, we should have the same thing in America today. And then let's also look at what we've got to do in a lot of our rural communities, and Iowa has this issue, so many of our states do, which is that in rural communities and in areas where hospitals are closing, because we have a backward system of compensating for care and reimbursement. And so there's a small population, high overhead, and the hospital has to close, even though that's the same community that has some of the highest need in terms of mental health treatment and substance abuse treatment. So we also have to configure the way that we're doing reimbursement around this, and also create incentives for mental health professionals to be in those areas where there is the greatest need. And I would advocate for that as well. In addition, and I'd be interested in her perspective on it, and I look forward to talking with her behind stage, is the issue of telemedicine. And really exploring the possibilities there. I have talked with mental health providers, I've talked with substance abuse treatment experts, and it is certainly an area worth exploring, and having the President of the United States advocate for putting real, substantial resources into all of the above.
Senator Harris, I'm curious about what your philosophy is for how change happens in our country. In a conversation recently, I believe you were on the Axelrod podcast not that long ago. You said that I'm just
a year and a half ago.
A year and a half ago, okay. I'm just gonna kind of, I think it's sort of what you said is really interesting, and I'm just gonna quote you here.
Okay.
This is this is what you said. When you want to improve a system, certainly there's a role to be played about marching and about banging down the door, and sometimes on a bended knee. There's also a role, which is to be at the table where decisions are made and influence the system from that perch. Right. And that's what I decided to do. So my question for you is, how does change happen, and how does that inform your run for president right now?
That's a great question. Change happens in many ways. I think some of the most significant change happens because the people demand it. And we organize, and we understand the power of the people to create a movement that will require change, even when institutions don't want to cede, even when institutions are stuck in status quo and will defend it at all cost, even when it is fatally flawed. People, and the power of people, in particular the power of people who are organized, are really, I think, the most powerful tool for change. You can look, for example, at what has happened around the criminal justice system. The reforms that I was able to do when I was a DA and when I was AG around creating initiatives like reentry initiatives focused on former drug sales offenders and getting them jobs and counseling. The work that we were able to do in terms of saying that we need to have a better system of focusing on prevention instead of just incarcerating whole groups of people. I know that I would not have been able to create that kind of systematic change and reform were it not for the incredible organizing and voice and movement that was happening from folks like Black Lives Matters and others, demanding that the systems change. So it's in all of those places. But to the point of your question, it is also us recognizing, hey, those of us who decide that might be our track for instituting change, let's go to those tables where the power of the decision making is taking place, and let's be at that table and reform and change the way the decisions are made in those places of power. And so I am a huge advocate of all of those methods of instituting and leading and often forcing change.
So, Senator Harris, as we talk about change, it is obvious this country is in need of some major changes. Yeah. You are not the first African-American woman to run for president.
That's right.
But you sort of have followed in, if you look at even the political history of the Democratic Party over the past 3 or 4 decades, we have always found that Black women in particular, dare I say, have come to the rescue of the Democratic Party and the progressive movement. What does your candidacy mean for people of color in this country, for women of color, but also what does your candidacy mean for America?
Yeah. Well, to the point of how you've prefaced your question, I stand on the shoulders of many people who have come before me, including Shirley Chisholm. And people like Barbara Jordan, and so many others who understood that power will not be given. Sometimes we may have to step up and just take it. And so I am part of something that came before me, and I hope during the time that I have the baton, if you think of this as a relay race, that during the time that I've been passed the baton, that I will carry it and move the issues and move us forward. I think about this in many ways. I think of it in the way that my mother would say to me, Kamala, you may be the first to do many things, but make sure you're not the last. And so that means in the process of achieving whatever we achieve, and I have been in a position of being elected to offices as the first woman, as the first person of color, it has been about making sure that we leave the door open and provide a path for others to follow, and I take that very seriously. There is the part about breaking barriers. And, I mentor a lot of people, and I recently was saying to a group of folks that I've mentored, I said, the thing about breaking barriers is you have to understand, and I kind of said, because I'm not sure if everyone's clear on this. So breaking barriers, it's not like you start on one side of the barrier and you just show up on the other side of the barrier. There's breaking involved. And when you break things, it's painful. And you might get hurt. You might get cut. And it will be worth it. And it will be worth it. But it is not without struggle and sacrifice and sometimes pain. And, all these kids looked at me when I said that, and their eyes were like saucers really big. And I said, I'm not saying it to scare you, but I do say this to prepare you. And so there is that part of this process that is also about recognizing that it will take great effort in some situations for folks to imagine what can be unburdened by what has been.
What can be. So, and I'll let my co-host jump in too. I've been having conversations with a certain style of Democrat that would brand themselves as pragmatic, right? And what they say to me is, it's a wonderful ideal to think that we can get to a place in this country where we have universal health care or universal education. But they'll say something like, practically speaking, we could never do that. Although we are one of the last industrialized countries in the developed world to not offer affordable health care to its citizens.
Right.
So what do you say, how do we get to a point where we change the conversation? How do we have that cultural change so that people understand that this can be done?
Right.
And then what's your plan for, they want to know how you pay for it. How do you talk to those Democrats that look at some of these ideals with skepticism?
I would say to them that that we have to reframe the perspective, and instead of looking at the issue of ensuring that all people have access to health care, because the premise there is that access to affordable health care should not be a privilege, it should be a right. It should not only be accessible to those who can afford it, it should be accessible to all. So then when people start saying cost, 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 my response is no, it's not about cost. It's about investment. It's about investment. One of the things I love about my friends in the private sector, people who run small businesses and family-run businesses, when they're looking at how they're running their business and making it successful, they capture the analysis of their effectiveness with 3 letters, ROI, return on the investment. That's how our government needs to work. Let's look at the return on the investment. And I'm going to tell you, I'll put money down on investing in the American public every day of the week. Every day of the week. And so that's going to be about investing in the health of the American public, knowing that with affordable health care for all at every stage of age and health. We will prevent worse outcomes, which will actually be a greater investment in the health and well-being of our community, and it'll be a better use of taxpayer dollars than treating those issues in an emergency room. Mm-hmm. On the issue of education, that is a straight up investment in our country and in our future. So that's how I think about it.
Go ahead.
So speaking of investments, I think this actually has a lot to do with what you're saying. So in Iowa, we have a pretty recent history of being pretty tough on our immigrant brothers and sisters. You probably know about this, from the nation's largest raid in Postville, Iowa back in 2008. Unfortunately, to most recently when the legislative session decided to pass Senate File 481, which became law. And basically what that does is it allows local entities, specifically police, to work more closely with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And it's been reported by CNN recently that when you were district attorney of San Francisco, you supported your city's policy of turning over some of the undocumented teenagers to ICE even before they had been convicted of a crime. So I was just wondering, I know that I've been watching you since you started running, and it seems like your position on immigration is quite good. So could you kind of give us some insight on how from that time, when it was for whatever reason, you were supporting this policy that was essentially handing over undocumented people to ICE before they had been convicted, to now, and kind of what's changed on that and how you came to those changes? And then I was wondering if you could also just talk a little bit about how, compared to like right now, the hot topic is the wall, but what do we actually need to do about immigration? I know you have some good things to share on that, so.
Sure.
Yeah.
In the first instance, the policy that you're referring to in San Francisco, that ended up being an unintended consequence of the policy, and I did not support that consequence of that policy. And that policy, I believe, has since changed because it was not the intended purpose of that policy. I'll say this, and I feel very strongly about it, and I always have, which is this: my background is as a prosecutor, and I want to know that be a person a victim of a rape or child molestation or a vicious violent crime, I want to know that that victim will be able to run in the middle of the street and wave down a police officer and receive protection and security without having to worry about if they do that, they'll be deported. And that's part of the problem with those policies. That's part of the problem with those policies, which is why I don't support policies that would have local police officers perform the function of immigration enforcement. We have purposely designed our government in a way that local government has certain responsibilities, state government has certain responsibilities, federal government has certain responsibilities. And if you meet with any police department in America, most will tell you they are barely keeping up with the domestic violence cases that come through the door, the robbery cases that come through the door, much less having to do the federal government's job of enforcing immigration policy. It's a bad approach, and it does not achieve public safety. Because I'm going to tell you, again, having handled these cases personally, one of the strongest tools in the tool belt of the predator who is committing a crime against an undocumented immigrant is to tell that victim, if you report the crime against you, it is you who will be treated as the criminal. So we have to check ourselves and look in the mirror. If we say that we are about public safety and making sure that our laws are enforced, well, that's a flawed policy, and it has no place in a civil society. Local police should not be doing the job of federal law enforcement.
I agree with you.
Senator, I kind of want to return to the topic of the historic nature of your candidacy just a little bit. Some people probably know that there's an affiliation between you, some of the people that are closest to you, and President Barack Obama. And just like when he ran, when you announced your candidacy, there questions popped up about your identity. Are you black enough? Is she too black? Did she eat the chicken and waffles at the restaurant
Right. Or
correctly?
did she really buy that multicolored sequin jacket?
Right.
I did.
Right.
And you should wear that at the Pride Parade, by the way. I heard that, and I was like, yes.
Yes. Meanwhile, we have nuclear proliferation to think about, but yes, those are the conversations that are being had right now in a presidential
Hey, a
election.
sequin jacket is important at the Pride Parade,
That is true. No
question.
question.
So, what did you learn, or how did you help? What did you observe from watching Barack Obama navigate issues of race and identity?
That's a great question,
how does that apply to your run now, or is this just an entirely different world we live in because of Donald Trump and in how he sort of made the issue so toxic and divisive?
That's a great question, Simeon. I mean, here, I actually was in Des Moines that week between Christmas and New Year's of 2007, working on the caucuses.
Yeah.
And which, again, back to the question about what it means to run for office, there is no job too small or too big. I had the responsibility of talking to voters and going to meetings, and I also had the responsibility on the night of the caucuses delivering pizzas to everybody who was hungry. So there is anything that is required must be done. Exactly.
That's very important, yeah.
But in that election cycle, so to your point, I supported President Obama when he ran for Senate. He supported me when I ran for my re-election as DA. When he decided to run for president, I was one of the first in California to endorse him, and supported him. I was even in Springfield with he and Michelle when they announced. And early on in his candidacy, people raised that question. Is he black enough? What is his identity? And I remember as a surrogate talking with the press and saying, you know what, this is a ridiculous conversation. And I believe it is informed by your limited capacity to know who black people are. And so let's get clear about that. And then I would literally go on in these interviews to say, for example, I went to Howard University. And if you visit Howard University on any Friday afternoon, there is this area in the middle of campus. It's about as big as a city block. It's covered with grass. We call it the yard. And on a Friday afternoon at Howard, at least when I was there, that was dress up day, not dress down day. And all the students would dress up and just kind of peacock across the yard, right? And if you stood in the middle of campus on any given day, you'd look over there at the Fine Arts Department and you would see young African American students, 18 through 24, just trying out their musical instruments or trying out their ballet steps. You could look over there and you would see the School of Medicine and young African Americans walking around in lab coats, School of Business with briefcases. You get the point. You would see that the president of the student body was also the football star. You would see that the person who excelled and was winning awards for science was also the homecoming queen. You would see the full diaspora and breadth and depth of who we are as black people in America. And you would understand then that it is a mistake to attempt to put anyone in a limited box that can fit into your discrete boxes that are limited in terms of the extent of your imagination or exposure. And that's how I think about that conversation then and now.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I started out by saying you're a top contender in this race. It's obvious, but there are a lot of other really good individuals in this primary field.
For sure.
What sets you apart, and why does America need Kamala Harris?
So I will agree with you that there are very talented people in this race, many of whom are my colleagues in the United States Senate, and I have a great deal of respect for them, and I believe each one of them brings an important voice. The voters will ultimately decide. But I will say that I believe part of the analysis and the ultimate decision will be made based on the experiences people have had. I have served in local government, state government, and federal government. I have seen what happens in Washington, D.C., what happens in terms of the priorities of an administration impact the lives of people every day at each of those levels. I believe that the American people right now want a fighter and someone who knows how to fight and has a record of fighting. And I can point to a number of issues that I've worked on over the years, including when I was Attorney General, leading an office of almost 5,000 people, and doing the work, for example, of taking on the 5 big banks of the United States, which was no small matter. And we'll all remember that Wall Street sneezed and we all got a cold. And they had produced these mortgage-backed securities. There was fraudulent lending practices, and you can believe they did not want to pay the amount that they should have to homeowners of my state, California, but of the nation, and that was a huge battle. I have a proven record of fighting. I took on the for-profit colleges, one of the biggest for-profit colleges, because they were scamming students who were just attempting to get an education and have a path towards success. So I think the voters will also look at who is a proven fighter, because you can talk about fighting, but I think this is a moment in time where we also want to see that you have the experience fighting. And then I think finally, the voters are going to decide and have to decide, but I certainly know that I have the ability to prosecute the current occupant of the White House in terms of prosecuting the case against why he should no longer serve, and we need change. So Mueller will, of course, deal with the other stuff. I'm not suggesting I'm doing that, but I am talking about the ability of a candidate who wants to unseat an incumbent president and who will be able to have the opportunity and the ability to prosecute the case against the current occupant and make the case for change.
Speaking of prosecution, I want to ask a foreign policy or national security related question,
Yes.
Senator. When Donald Trump leaves office through losing an election or through impeachment, there will be many throughout the entire world who will be unsure about what our role is, what our values are, who are our real allies, or what our commitments are to the global international system and international politics. What is your vision for America's role in the world in 2020 and beyond?
Well, let me start by saying I will not conduct foreign policy through a tweet. And I also believe very strongly that, one, we have to appreciate our standing in the world, at least historically. We've had good days and bad days, to be sure. But on a good day, we have been a nation of people who are respected for the values that were part of the founding of our country. We are a nation that has been respected at valuing human rights, civil rights, and freedoms. We've not always lived up to those ideals, by the way. We're all clear-eyed about that. But at the very least, we have been a presence and a voice that says that these are important ideals. Our strength also has always been our ability to recognize the power of working with our allies, recognizing the power of being a member of NATO, for example, and respecting the fact that unilateralism is not a sign of strength, and in fact may end up being a real weakness because of a failure to communicate and respect and understand that some of the best work that we can do on the globe will be done with our neighbors and our allies. I will conduct foreign policy in a way that also understands that we do not embrace our historical enemy and place their opinion on national security above the opinion of the intelligence community of the United States. And then, and then let's look at it. It is about everything we have seen from most recently that display in Munich to one of the most imminent threats to us, existential threats to us as human beings, which is climate change. And the need to now earn back our authority to be among leadership in dealing with what is a real and imminent and very imminent threat to our health and well-being. And understand that some of the best work we can do is through the Paris Accord, through working with our allies, understanding that collectively we will be much stronger than we are with the kind of approach that we have seen with this administration. And I have to I want to put a fine point on that. Because you asked about foreign policy. When we think about foreign policy, we think about national security. And again, we are not talking enough about climate change. Look, wars classically have been fought over oil. In a hot minute, they're going to be fought over water. When we see what's happening around the globe in terms of shifting populations, which is leading to tension, which is leading to shifts around who is in charge and where everybody is going. This is all partly attributable to what is happening in terms of climate change. We have to have leadership around foreign policy that understands that among our priorities, climate change must be one of our highest.
Senator Harris, I wish we could spend another couple hours chatting with you.
I'll come back.
Thank you.
I'm going to spend a lot of time in Iowa.
You should. But I know there are some folks here who probably want to ask you some questions, so I do want to move to that. And while we are getting set up to do that, or as Sim and Misty, I think, are going to help set that up, okay. I'll ask one more quick question.
Yes.
And that is this: we have a lot of younger folks who listen to our podcasts. Okay. We tend to find a lot of support among millennial generations. Uh-huh. There are young folks on this stage who are getting ready to go to college. We have young elected officials here. As we set up for questions, if you could have a direct line into these young folks and give them a piece of advice as these coming generations are facing some of the most difficult challenges I think this country has seen, and we've already ticked off a few during this conversation. What do you say to this next generation of leaders?
Well, first is that you, and I think you know that, which is why you are literally on this stage, which is that our future is really in your hands. And you have obviously decided to take on a role of leadership by being here and being a part of this conversation in such a meaningful way. I would urge you to always know the power of seeing what can be, unburdened by what has been. I would urge you to always fight for that, in spite of the fact that so many may tell you it can't be done, or it's not time. I would urge you to know that some of the best work and the greatest strengths of who we are as a nation and who our leaders have been those who can see and then fight toward that. And know, by the way, guys, that status quo is a tough thing to get past. People are invested in things the way they've been. I can't tell you how many times people said to me, well, why do you need to do it differently than the way it's always been done? It's always been done this way, they'll say. Which is really just shocking that anyone would think that should be the point in defense of status quo. But you're a generation that understands the power of innovation also. And when we talk about innovation, let's always remember and remind other people who aren't clear about it, that innovation is the pursuit of doing things more efficiently and more effective and faster and being more accurate, right? We don't engage in innovation because we're bored with things the way they've been, right? But because we know that it can be done better. So be motivated by that and know that we will always encourage you. And also know what I said earlier. It's going to be difficult. And there are going to be rough moments. And this is where I'd also say to you that, you know, it's difficult to be a leader because sometimes you're going to find that you're the only one thinking the way you are in that room. Sometimes you're going to be surrounded by people who just tell you it can't be done. And so the thing to remember is that there are a lot of us who know that change is possible, and you got to hold on to it. And then I would just give you a piece of personal advice. Surround yourself with people who are invested in your success. Make good friends and keep good friends. That's really important because as a leader, you're going to have long days, you're going to have rough days, and it's really important to have people around you who you can call in the middle of the night and you can laugh at the thing you're not supposed to laugh at, or you can shout, or you can cry, or you can, God forbid, curse, and do it without judgment, and then get back out there and keep pushing ahead. But I'm just so excited that you're all on this stage, and we're all on this stage together. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, God.
So I think I've been told that we have 2 microphones out in the audience. Is that right?
Hey, yes,
Misty?
we're on the audience. This is
Misty and
Misty. Can we turn the house lights up a little bit?
Oh, there she is.
All right, we have just a few minutes, so we're going to take a few questions, and we're going to start here.
Hi, Miss Harris. My name is Renita Herman, and I'm from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. My first question is, will you be accepting any PAC or big donor money?
No, I'm not accepting any corporate PAC money and
Okay.
or federal lobbyist money.
Okay, and that's great. And as president, would you direct DARPA to develop a 21st century cybersecurity system to protect our digital lives? Maybe charge them to come up with a new system, because we can't build a future based on this computer system that we have anymore.
Yeah, so let me tell you, the issue of cybersecurity is something I care a lot about, and I'm glad you raised it because we are certainly not talking about it enough. It's something I worked on during the years that I was AG of California, and I even have a bill that's about what we need to do around protecting cybersecurity around elections. In fact, it's a bipartisan bill that I serve on Senate Intelligence Committee, in addition to Senate Judiciary and Homeland Security and Budget. And I will tell you that we have to understand that if we're going to protect and be concerned about national security, we need to understand that we are on the verge of and need to be prepared to defend against what I call a war without blood. And that's about cyber attacks. Let's all be very clear. Unfortunately, it has turned out to be a debatable point, although it is without any need for debate. Russia interfered in the election of the President of the United States. And so what my bill proposes is that what we do is we upgrade the states around their elections infrastructure. The leader of the Senate will not put that bill on the floor for a vote. And so again, history is going to show that we're on the wrong side of that because we need to get a leg up on this. The issue of cybersecurity also is about understanding, frankly, and the way I think about it, it's almost a misnomer, because truly when you're looking at the issue of cybersecurity, we will not actually ever be completely secure. So what it has to be about is about putting policies in place that mitigate against cyber attacks. And that has to be about not only recognizing our vulnerability on issues like elections, but our vulnerability in terms of all of our power grids. Everything that keeps cities and towns functioning is in one way or another reliant on a secure cyber system. And right now we are not ready, and we are very vulnerable as a country. And so to your point, we have to, especially at the federal level, take this issue very seriously and put real resources into it and bring the experts in, because there is so much more that we can be doing, and it is very much top of mind. And yes, I will take it very seriously. think we should turn on the mic. Or I'll repeat it if it doesn't work. Larissa Cole College, Jr. Oh, and I'm one of the only senators that waved back at her when she was an intern at DC. Happy to repeat that. Okay, go on. How do you handle being a woman of color in situations where you may be the only one who looks like you? And how do you handle those issues when you're being asked, are you sure, and can you do it, and is it your time? And I'm going to tell you first of all, have a seat. I'm going to tell you first of all, here's what I want you to know. You will continue to have experiences where you will be the only one like you in a room. You will continue to have experiences where you're the only one who has the experiences that you've had when you're in that room, be it a boardroom, a courtroom, a hearing room. And here's what I want you to know when you're in those rooms, and you got to know it in your head and in your heart. We're all in that room with you. We're all in that room with you, cheering you on and expecting shoulders back, chin up, and that you will speak and you will speak up and you will know that your voice is an important voice to be spoken and that it must be heard. It is really important for you to know that, because the strength of who we are will always be when at those decisions, at those tables when important decisions are being made, when we have all the voices of those who will be impacted by the policies and by the work. And so when you're there speaking up, it's not about you. It's about all of the people who should be seen in that room and will be seen and heard through your voice, right? And so that's how I want you to approach it. Okay. And we're proud of you.
Hello, Senator Harris. I'm Jesselyn. I'm a proud board member for Planned Parenthood here in Iowa.
Oh, great.
And I wanted to ask you specifically, what would you do for women, whether it's healthcare, the economy, name a policy, what you would specifically do for women or push for women in the first 100 days of office?
For sure. Well, thank you for your work with Planned Parenthood, because as we know, yet again, a woman's right to choose is under attack. And on the issue of choice, as with so many issues that are about civil rights, I often think back to a famous quote from Coretta Scott King, which I'll paraphrase. And she said, the fight for civil rights, and you can read into that, the fight for justice, the fight for equality, the fight for civil rights must be fought and won with each generation. And when she said that, I think she had 2 points in mind. One is that it is the very nature of these fights that whatever gains we make, they will not be permanent. It's the nature of it. And understanding then that it is the nature of it, do not despair. Do not throw up our hands when it's time to roll up our sleeves, right? Your nails grow, you don't say, oh my God, my nails are growing. You just cut them, right? So we just do what we gotta do. On the issue of women's issues. So I was elected DA of San Francisco as the first woman. I was elected Attorney General of California as the first woman. I was elected to the United States Senate as only the second black woman elected to the United States Senate in its history. And over the course of each of these races, these reporters would come up to me, they put a microphone in front of me, and they'd ask me this really unique question. And the question went like this: so what's it like to be the first woman, fill in the blank? And I'd look at them and I'd say, well, I don't really know how to answer that question, because you see, I've always been a woman, but I'm sure a man could do the job just as well. But another question that I'm sure you've been asked, and many of us have been asked, is that they'd put the microphone in front of us and they'd say, so, talk to us about women's issues. And I'd look at them and I'd say, you know what? I am so glad you want to talk about the economy. Right? Because when you think about it, when you lift up the economic status of women, you lift up the economic status of children and of families and of neighborhoods and communities, and all of society benefits. So, the economy, and that means passing the ERA. Let's start there. It means addressing what is still very significant and concrete and clear disparities around wages. It is about recognizing that, but I'm going to say this to keep going with the list. Women's issues are everyone's issues, right? They're everyone's issues. And everyone's issues are women's issues. So let's also deal with the fact that where a woman is the primary parent, that it's going to be a woman's issue, but it's both parents' issue, affordable childcare. And we need to have a national policy for affordable childcare. Let's talk about the need for women, but women are co-parenting with their spouses, and it may be another woman, but it might also be a man. And the reality is that then we're talking about the need for universal pre-K. Let's talk about women's issues. Let's get back to that subject of national security. Let's talk about women's issues, climate change. Let's talk about women's issues, the need to have a system. We saw this with the Kavanaugh hearings, where people take seriously the experience that women have, but men have also, with issues like sexual assault. After the Kavanaugh hearings, the only silver lining to that, from my perspective, was that finally, because of the courage of this spectacular American by the name of Dr. Ford, who came forward because she felt that the decision makers should know what she knew. And she went through an awful process. But because of her courage, it encouraged a national conversation on an issue that for too long has been kind of buried in the shadows because people don't want to talk about it. It makes them uncomfortable. But that is another example of an issue. Yes, it impacts women. It also impacts men. So, but what I will say is this. One of the most fundamental issues that is a woman's issue is reproductive health care. And we got to deal with that. And we have to deal with it on a number of levels. One, every woman should be allowed to make decisions about her own body, and their government should not be trying to make those decisions for her. Every woman should have access to all that she needs around reproductive health care. I did a town hall yesterday, and there was a young woman who was talking about her need to have birth control for a health-related issue for which birth control can only help, but yet there are policies restricting women's access to birth control. Let's talk about the fact that women should not have to suffer in society because we have the responsibility for perpetuating the human species. And our bodies were constructed with that purpose. That's a woman's issue. And I appreciate your leadership on all of this, so thank you for the question. Thank you.
Senator Harris, we want to thank you so much for joining us. We have surpassed the amount of allotted time we had with you, and we know you